The United Kingdom has approximately 60 days of oil and gas reserves. Most of them are not even stored in the United Kingdom. They're stored in storage facilities in Belgium and in Netherlands. US has plenty of reserves, and President Trump is unleashing some of this. The headline was about becoming a technology leader. But what powers the data centers? Because of the crisis in the Middle East, only those supply routes, you do not get 60 days. Unfortunately, you get weeks, maybe days, and then lights will go out, literally. Welcome to Sovereign Brief. I'm Mark Minevich, AI strategist and investor. I have with me two of my good friends and colleagues who are going to make sure that I do not get away with anything. Dominic is one of the sharpest environmental energy minds in UK that I know, coming from a very grounded background from global UK and European perspective. And my colleague Will brings the question that every boardroom in America actually needs answered. So what does it mean for us? Gentlemen, let's get into it.
Yes, I know today you wanted to talk about digital sovereignty, what that means. And for us, the definition here that we're working off of today, it's the physical and virtual assets, data centers, network infrastructure, softwares, cloud platforms that are controlled, operated, and governed by a specific entity within its own jurisdictions, free from undue external influence, dependence on foreign entities, and it's free from foreign override, foreign legal reach, or foreign supply chain dependency. Mark, in layman's terms, that means every bit of your digital footprint you own as an entity, correct?
So, Will, it's both simpler and actually more alarming
Oh,
than
no.
people realize.
Yeah.
Here's the definition that I use. Sovereign digital infrastructure is the physical and virtual assets that the country possesses, the company possesses, we citizens possess. Well, most citizens don't, but some of the wealthy ones, like Mark Zuckerberg and others, do possess data centers, network infrastructure, software, cloud platforms. They're controlled, operated, and governed with your own jurisdiction, free from foreign oversight or override, or unique external dependency. And the key word here that I want our audience to come away is jurisdiction. Not where the server physically are. Who cares? Who could legally compel what is on them? That's the real question here. Dominic, what do you think?
Well, I think that the overriding concern that we need to be thinking about in terms of all of this infrastructure is how it's provided with energy, because energy is the source of the whole process. And without energy security, we don't have AI, we don't have technology. And as you say, the Americans have a significant strategic reserve. And if you actually go back to the Yom Kippur War and the 1973 oil crisis, the federal government did put in significant steps to develop that strategic reserve. So I think America has a strong advantage on energy security compared to Europe. And we don't have that security here. So this week, the British government has announced a £500 million sovereign plan of action for artificial intelligence. But at the same time, we are increasing reliance on Middle East oil and gas. And as you said earlier, most of our storage reserves are actually on the continent of Europe. And when we left the European Union, when we did Brexit, we actually reduced the amounts of reserve capacity we had, and we moved all of it offshore to a large degree. So, the danger we now face is that the whole technological platform, the evolution of AI, is dependent on oil security from one of the most volatile and unstable parts of the world. And that's definitely a major problem for countries like the United Kingdom. But America's not immune to that either.
Yeah, Dominic, I agree. I think what we're saying is, and I want to be blunt about this, most companies and governments are tenants. They're tenants, they're not owners.
Correct.
Exactly.
And they have rented space in somebody else's backyard, somebody else's digital infrastructure, and tenants could be evicted. And that's a problem, or monitored, or cut off. The moment there is political or regulations dispute, landlord has the leverage. So I think we have major issues here. And unfortunately, there's also an issue related to weaponization of this infrastructure. I call it weaponization. Weaponization, we've seen it already with what happened with SWIFT, weaponization of the dollar settlement system. It's being controlled by a few parties. And now imagine chip experts. Imagine Russia was, as we know, as we excluded from SWIFT in 2022, I believe. It happened essentially overnight. So imagine if US, where we're located right now, says tomorrow AWS services are suspended for a country that has crossed the red line. Every government relies on AWS, and there are many governments that are relying on sovereignty of AWS today. Unfortunately, one of the AWS data center facilities was hit in United Arab Emirates. So this AWS is really public infrastructure, but it could go dark. It went dark. It's not science fiction. So that's the policy options that currently exist. And you're right. We have problems with energy. We have problems with weaponization. So what do we do at this point?
Yeah, and I would also add that the one thing we're learning from events in the Gulf at the moment is that you can have a huge superpower technology at your disposal, like the United States government has, but often you can be up against state or non-state actors who are using very basic technology, like drones or cyber type attack, that actually can cause huge damage from a military but also an economic perspective. And the actual opportunity you have to stop or prevent that costs a huge amount of technology and money. So, this is a technological war, but actually low technology drones and other means of causing havoc that in the hands of governments like Iran or non-state actors can become a significant risk factor now for actually maintaining this sovereign control and structure that we need for the technology industry to continue to grow, as we've seen. And that's really played out in the last few weeks in the Gulf.
Yeah, so I agree. We have to define this infrastructure a little bit more. I think for the audience, this infrastructure has a lot of challenges, what we were discussing for years on the tech-based industrial revolution. We're living through this now. And I want to give us three reasons that I think we're underappreciated even by people who follow the space closely. Something really important is happening. First, AI runs on infrastructure, the way the industrial revolution ran on coal and any other energy source. You cannot train a frontier model or any other model on ambition. It doesn't happen. You need compute. You need massive energy compute that will power those data centers with chips only a handful companies in the world know how to make. There's control of this infrastructure. You control the AI, control asymmetric control. Asymmetric controls meaning in every domain that matters, right? Economic output, military capabilities, scientific leadership, and diplomacy. Those are the key areas that I think many business leaders simply are not fully understanding. And maybe, Dominic, we could unbundle this a little bit more. And then, Will, you may have some thoughts on this.
I think the problem we have internationally is we're just not prepared. We're not joining the dots. At a company level, executives in the boardroom are not thinking geopolitically, but I think governments are not thinking geopolitically to a large degree either. So everything is interconnected, the infrastructure, the energy needs. We've got to remember also there's a big overriding problem that we have here is also how we grow food and food security. So at the moment we're thinking in the Gulf that it's all about oil, but it's also about fertilizer. That is oil based, of course. And if fertilizer doesn't enter the food chain and farmers don't get access to it in North America, or the price goes significantly up, which we could well see happen in the next few weeks, that will have a massive inflationary impact in economies within the food chain. So we're trying to think about technology, but we can't take away these other issues that are going on around it, which will have an impact on the economy and our ability to plan for the future as well. And if we learn anything, I think it's thinking about where all these issues come together, planning, and that's a certain level of sovereign control, of course, and government cooperation, but it's also about national sovereignty. It's about putting in place the infrastructure, the security measures that you need as a government, working with industry to prepare for what we're now seeing playing out in the Gulf, because this is going to happen more and more often.
Yeah, as a business owner, as a leader, Mark, you're in your day-to-day, every day, navigating your life, and then you don't understand the degree to which geopolitics is going to reshape your future in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. And if you're somebody who's trying to build a business to last years and decades, you have to be tuned into what this means. What countries are you reliant on? Because I would bet that most business owners don't know how many foreign entities, Mark, that they actually rely on to just run their business.
Will, as you know, United States grid is still heavily fossil fuel dependent.
Yep, correct.
It's a big problem, especially in the heartland of America. What are your thoughts on this, and how do we change this model?
We've sold off bits of the Midwest to foreign entities over the course of my lifetime, at least. I'm in my mid-40s. And so it's how can we bring some of that back? Is the cat too far out of the bag? That's what companies here have to start thinking of. How can they invest in, because I know from Minnesota through Texas, there are tons of technology companies that will help you become digitally sovereign. So you can't wean off all that dependency at once, but you can start to pull back to make yourself stronger so you can pivot quicker. That's my thoughts on it. You need to ready yourself now for what is going to happen. It may not be at your door today. You feel safe in the middle of the United States, but it's going to come.
Here's what I think. I think the energy, what we're hearing from our conversation, is the hidden variable in every sovereign AI conversation around the world. You could really build the most impressive data center, and we've seen the most impressive ones in the United States, in Abu Dhabi, in Singapore. But if it goes dark because your energy supply was cut, and it will happen, you could build the most extraordinary building, the most expensive building in the world, the best and the greatest, as they say. But what happens?
Yeah.
And so what do we do about this? And I think now suddenly we're seeing, and the point of this really important podcast is the digital infrastructure has become a geopolitical weapon. It really has.
Correct.
And we have the receipts. We spoke about SWIFT. We know the China situation. We know the chip control. We know that China, for rightful reasons, at least we think so in the United States, Huawei cannot get chips because they're using those chips for other reasons. But that's not the end of the story. So now we have to figure out, how do we deal with all of this economic coercion? And maybe you have some other thoughts, Dominic, on this.
We're all focused now on the Straits of Hormuz, as we should be, because it's the main route, for carrying gas and oil into the international markets. And, it hasn't taken much for Iran to cause huge disruption to the Strait of Hormuz. And we're now seeing a situation where the American government and the French government and others are thinking, can we keep it open? But actually, that's quite a difficult thing to do. Mines can be sowed in the waters, ships can be blown up, as we've seen. Huge disruption. And then suddenly you have this backlog of traffic that you can't release. And if that goes on for weeks and weeks, and the International Atomic Energy Agency and other agencies around the world are saying now that this is the worst energy crisis we've seen since 1973. And I come back to the other thing that happened in 73 is we saw a massive spike in food prices as well on the back of that energy crisis. And we could see exactly the same thing happen here. And the other thing we obviously need to now consider is that, Mark, you're very familiar with that region of the Middle East. Huge amounts of investment has come into the United States, particularly in the technology sector from that part of the world. Will that flow of investment continue? Or will we now see a significant shift in investment patterns, which could cause some long-term problems for the industry developments as well?
Yeah, so Dominic, the situation, you brought us to the present moment, and the present moment is not pretty, unfortunately, and it's not going to get resolved anytime soon. I wish it does. I want to bring hope and prosperity, not only for that region. I'm there constantly,
Yes.
but the conflict is now involving a state of Iran, and its cascading effects are across the Middle East, obviously, but it's not only Middle East, as you pointed out, it's across the world, and it's not just a security story. It's a sovereign digital infrastructure story. It's reshaping our investment decisions. Right now, you pointed that out. We don't know how the boardrooms and the chief executive officers of the Western companies are going to react. Have they absorbed this yet? Investors that are seeking money in the Middle East, what will happen? We don't know. So we have to unbundle this. And Will, what do you think about this military conflict that is occurring in the Middle East? And you've seen some of those data centers being impacted. You've seen the situation, which is progressing. Obviously, U.S. has a huge military advantage, and we're putting a lot of pain now on the regime, but it's still a lot of companies and a lot of organizations, especially dependent on energy and resources and supply chain, are suffering. And so what's your take on it?
To zoom out, what becomes very apparent for an analogy is how much the entire world sort of lives paycheck to paycheck when it comes to energy and it comes to data. That, this is what, 2 weeks in the making, and already we're worried that basically the world will shut down. So that's, I think everyone needs to spend a little time thinking about that this happened a couple weeks ago, and it's the cascading effects across not only the region, but the entire globe. And, you were talking about the lead players kind of in this area. You mentioned the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and there's France and India. I mean, how do those, Mark, I want to get you and Dominic, those countries and then the major corporate leaders, Do they have a different role or responsibility now? How quick can they pivot to this new reality?
I'm hearing
Yeah, and
right now,
also,
Dominic and Will, I'm hearing that countries like Philippines and Thailand that are not involved in this particular conflict, they're already suffering. The energy resources are drying up. They have, you can't bring new energy supplies, and a lot of it is coming through Strait of Hormuz and through Indonesia and Thailand and that area, and they're being stopped cold. And so they're suffering. They can't get energy into their houses, into their cars. There's no gasoline. And we have a real problem here. And because, let's point this out, Strait of Hormuz carries fifth of the world's oil. Any serious military escalation threatens the passage not only to the Middle Eastern countries, but globally. And as we know, our audience, AI data centers and AI companies and technology companies, they're extraordinary energy hungry, and energy hungry. So this conflict has disrupted energy. It disrupted gas prices at the pump, and it directly increases operating costs to the urgency of infrastructure across the world, the countries that I mentioned, and it's already happening in some parts of the United States, and it's going to happen more. And Dominic, you're about to say probably, I'm sure you're seeing it in the United Kingdom as well.
we're seeing significant concerns about inflation coming back into the system, just when we thought we'd started to bring it down, as you've seen in the United States as well. If you're looking at oil prices are rising rapidly, haulage prices are rising rapidly, the whole food supply chain. I talked about fertilizer. Look at fertilizer. The global fertilizer market is the global food supply market, and the two are interlinked. The other thing I would say that we're beginning to learn about all of this is, and I've known it for a long time, and many of us have, is that all the infrastructure, the oil and gas infrastructure in that region, is not easily defended. It sits there, and you can fire a drone that's worth $20,000 at it, and you can do a significant disruption to it, which is what the Iranians have been doing. So with a relatively small amount of money and quite basic technology, you can hold the world to ransom. And I think that's something that we now need to think about. I think the American government and the French and the Europeans and others, we're going to have to think about how we police and control the Strait of Hormuz. I think there's going to have to be a lot more thought about defending that vital infrastructure, energy infrastructure in that part of the world. Because the real danger that we could now face is that if Iran melts down and there's tribal factions fighting each other and the whole region starts to come apart, you could have terrorist organizations acting independently of each other, blowing up oil and gas facilities where we've got no control at all. So we could be going into a state of anarchy in the most important energy resource part of the world. And the final point I'd make on Dubai is that Dubai sits there and has been extremely successful in modeling itself as a center hub of finance and tourism and leisure. But actually, the region it sits in is extremely dangerous. And most people, I think, have been completely oblivious to that. They've flown in and flown out and don't think about where it sits. But now you can see how dangerous the area that it sits. I'm not certain, Mark, as to whether confidence can be brought back into that marketplace so easily. So even if the conflict comes to an end, will people return? Will they invest? Will they feel as confident as they did before? Has that been broken?
Yeah, Dominic, you're raising the right points here. And I think Will alluded to that there is impact which will happen to, and Dominic, you alluded to that as well, to the investment coming from that region, sovereign wealth funds. The Gulf states, of course, are huge investors. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, they've been deploying extraordinary amount of money, billions and trillions of dollars of scale to build infrastructure that reduce, and the point is a reduction of dependency on some of the Western technology stacks. They want to do this. So Mubadala, MGX, the Public Investment Fund, they're talking about hundreds of billions earmarked for domestic data centers and AI capabilities. Now, this calculus today is all complicated. It's nobody knows where it's going to go. And unfortunately, I think there will be some level of pullback because the safety concern, because the confidence concern is not there. And the countries are now figuring out what they need to do to defend their sovereignty, to make sure they focus a lot more on security. So cybersecurity and all of that is going to get more priority, unfortunately. And so some of that investment can be pulled in. But I'm also concerned, Will, that in the United States, the energy markets, even though we are pulling some oil energy from our energy reserve, the prices are going to get disrupted, meaning the lives are going to get disrupted here. How will Silicon Valley react? How will Wall Street react? How will all the investors react? Where the alarms are going to come from? It's sounding right now. People are just pointing out right now, left and right. Let's have a strategy. Let's point. And there's no strategy. There's no strategy right now in any company on geopolitical risks. And they should have a strategy. This is all about resilience. We learned this during COVID, that we had no strategy. We lost a lot of people. A lot of lives were lost. So now we're coming back and we have loss of confidence. And we're now seeing prices hike everywhere, not only just gas, but our regular supplies. So what's going to happen in the United States, Will?
In the U.S., a couple things to zoom out a little. We'll have to I think solve the crisis of today before we can solve the crisis of tomorrow. In my opinion, we have to, I don't know how well we'll be able to do it, make nice with our friends in Mexico and Canada again, their oil reserves, Central and South America and Canada, large oil reserves there. That's going to be one thing we're going to have to do, figure out that relationship again and make it a little more amicable. And then you talked about it, Mark, and we talked about it off air, the three of us, we were going back and forth, that how much geopolitics is reshaping Silicon Valley, even if they don't know that that's happening. And so these guys, to get back to our point today, like we have to figure out how can those companies and those innovators and the leaders of tomorrow become more digitally sovereign. And you sent over some things that are stopping them. The things they have to think about: cost, chip dependency, energy security, talent scarcity, regulatory fragmentation. There's so much to think about. That how can these, what would you recommend if you're going into these companies? What do they need to start doing today and then throughout the rest of the next year to 2 years to shore themselves up against this same thing happening again, disrupting their entire business model?
Yeah, Will, you pointed out all the things that need to happen. I want to mention for the audience is simply, again, coming back because we're going to spend some time, the capital that was earmarked, it was already earmarked from the Gulf states for long-term investments for Western, North American particularly, but also European companies in AI. The point is it will be redirected. We just have to, we will be redirected near term for security resilience. And it's going to happen simultaneously. I'm not saying all of the investments are going to be cut off, but some of that is maybe more long term. So we have to figure out the strategy relates to the funding itself, and that's really what I call strategic investing. The governments globally have to figure this out. Will digital infrastructure be in a position to run properly? What if cloud access is suddenly denied? What if chip access or experts are going to be sanctioned? What is going to happen with those sovereign AI investments? All of those things are probably inevitable at this point. Most likely it's going to happen. So we need to go back and now figure out what the solutions will be. And before we get into the solutions, I want to bring Dominic in on the United Kingdom. And what are you seeing in terms of the overall strategy to this crisis coming in from UK and also from European folks? And then we could get into some of the companies who are the lead players that we're discussing and try to really unbundle the lead players.
I think, this particular crisis could not have come at a worse time for countries like the United Kingdom and France and other European countries, because they're trying to play catch up on sovereign AI to a large degree. They're looking at how they can bring in data centers, how they can bring in chip manufacturers, how they can bring in the best brains, the talent that we need for the future. Now, London, in the last week has been very much publicizing itself as a center of AI development, compared with San Francisco and other cities that we're familiar with on Silicon Valley and California. There is a lot to be said for saying that London has a potential, to bring in more investment, and companies are coming in. But as we said earlier on, we are at the whim, to quite honestly, at the moment, of American foreign policy. And the question I would pose to both of you really is, when decisions are taken in the White House, can we not have a situation by which the business community has some influence over the decision-making process? Because if I looked at what's gone on in the Gulf in the last few weeks, I don't think the business community was in any way involved in those decisions. The military clearly was, and there were people around the president that made the decisions. But actually, it strikes me, and this is something I think the Europeans are very much looking at, including the Italian government at the moment, who are not particularly comfortable where this is. It's not just a British and a French thing. I think it's, why was this not thought out? Why were the implications of this policy long-term not thought out? And that's not just for security. It's for the business community. It's for the global economy and the impact it's having. And I don't know, Will, what would your view be? Is there going to be a view in the boardrooms and Mark that actually we can't do this again unless the business community is part of that discussion, that they're engaged in these decision-making processes?
I mean, you'd have to have someone within the administration that is their specific role. How will this affect the global economy, the local economy? And to have that person to have the presidency, or whether it's this president, the next president, the one after it. Every 4 years we've been switching in the United States, which is rare here. We've had, I think, 3 straight one-term presidents. That hasn't happened since the 1800s, I believe, in the United States. So it's been an interesting time here. So that is going to have to be something that if we learn from this, which we will, we always do, that you have to have at least one person in that administration, whether it's at the secretary level or just the advisor level, that if this happens, then we need to have a plan for what comes after that economically, and how it's going to affect us. And are we shored up for that? Because those are problems you have to solve long in advance.
Yeah, and that probably a certain amount of consultation, Mark, with partners in the region. Not only that America has military bases, but it has long-term partnerships with those nations who are significant investors to its economy, as we've just spoken about. All of that is now under threat, of course.
All of it is under threat. And Will and Dominic, I hear your points. The business community, unfortunately, is going to suffer more in this terrible crisis. And the question is how to get them more engaged and more involved. We've seen the situation with Anthropic. They were involved in Department of War on a very strategic level. The challenge is for Silicon Valley and any type of enterprises, especially in the United States. They want to be involved not only in just providing the tools and capabilities and cloud. They want to be involved in decision-making process. And then it comes to the point is, how could they be involved and why should they be involved? Are they elected? Have we elected leaders from Meta? We elected leaders from Oracle? Have we elected Palantir and other leaders? But they clearly, Anthropic, they clearly want to be involved. So it's a funny situation that the governments feel, well, we're getting tools, we're getting technology, we're getting all that expertise, but why should we consult them when they're not elected by the public? So the decisions are made by governments because they feel that they have the electorates behind them. That's not necessarily the case. And maybe the business people have a lot to say because they are responsible for a lot of the investments and economic growth in the US and globally. But at this point, there is a delicate balance going on. In fact, I would say another war between business community that is basically saying, well, we want to have a say. We want to have a say if surveillance is done. We want to have a say if you follow our values. And if you don't follow our values, why should our technology be used? But right now, the governments, at least in the US, is basically saying that the decision is primarily ours. And unfortunately, it complicates the situation. I want to now step back a little bit and discuss what is actually going on in terms of who is actually building this right now. We spoke about all of those companies. We spoke about those announcements and failures, especially coming from the governments. There are players who are building genuine sovereign digital infrastructure. And sometimes they're AI first, or they're nation states first, or focusing on their companies. But, let's look at the situation where UAE has done something spectacularly genuine and sophisticated, but they're not getting enough credit. I don't think through MGX and G42, they're building it's not aligned compute architecture. It's a data center capacity spanning through the Middle East, Asia Pacific, North Africa, and Turkey. They're trying to work with the United States and other countries, but they're building their own sovereign stack. And they were in previous years using more of the Chinese technology. Now they're using more US, and they're positioning themselves. They want to position themselves as the Switzerland of the AI infrastructure, serving both blocks of the world. This is geopolitical leverage that we haven't seen in years. And so they're investing heavily, and we've seen Mazda investing in renewable energy. We've seen serious exploration of small modular nuclear called SMR. that's happening in Silicon Valley and other parts of the world. That's pretty big. Energy constraint is real, so capital is trying to address this. And so we're seeing a lot of the technology growth in that part of the world. How about solving the energy problem globally? What are you thinking, Dominic? How could that be solved through all of those technology companies?
I think there's two things here, isn't there? Firstly, the President of the United States has a particular view about windmills and renewable energy, and he can be very critical about it. But if we're in the United Kingdom at the moment, we can thank our lucky stars that we do have a significant amount of renewable energy that's actually been put onto the grid, because that gives us a buffer to a degree. But as I said, we're still very much dependent on oil and gas imports from the Middle East. My view would be that some of that debate about net zero needs to shift. It needs to shift to a debate about renewable energy that gives you security without having to rely upon more volatile parts of the world. The other thing I think we need to see is a significant shift, if you already mentioned there, Mark, in the next stage of nuclear reactor development, because, we've got to move beyond 3 Mile Island and Fukushima and Chernobyl and all the fears generated around nuclear reactors, because ultimately, even though we've had disasters, the level of loss and the level of health problems they've generated was far, far exaggerated. And ultimately, I think we know that the best way of generating renewable, safe, clean energy is via nuclear. And I think if we're going to have enough to support the AI development and data center needs for the global economy, we have to put nuclear center stage of that. I would hope that actually what comes out of this crisis in the Gulf is that it will speed up that investment in those new technologies, in those fast breeder reactors, in those mini reactors that are being developed that can be, put in place in a relatively short period of time, rather than these hugely costly infrastructure projects when it comes to building nuclear power stations that we've seen. And that countries like Germany that switched off their nuclear power industry because of fears following the Fukushima situation, will now look at how silly that decision was, that you need to come back on that. So I think we need to put energy security right at the heart of the global economy again. To a degree, it went all the way back to 1973 and the oil crisis. It was a result of that. But we got complacent. We didn't learn all the lessons from that particular crisis to a degree that's now repeating itself now, but it's playing out far worse, because we know all the technologies that we're talking about are so dependent on that energy. And correct me here, Mark, I think we see AI as being a virtuous path of development. It will keep moving forward. It'll only keep moving forward if we have the energy to supply it with. And if that energy supply starts to break down, everything around it will break down as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the way I see it.
You're absolutely right, Dominic. And in Europe specifically, I do want to point out that France, especially the European Union, is probably the most aggressive sovereign investor in energy and AI. They pledged billions of euros. We see great examples of what's happening there. Mistral is a new model, open source, completely open source model, layer sovereignty play. We now see colleagues of mine like Jan LeCun and others who are trying to build new companies. And this is a completely new model called World Model, and they're building it in France, not in the United States. Of course, they will have offices in the United States, in Singapore and other parts, but the headquarters is in France. So this is all real. And Dominic, you're absolutely right that there, unfortunately, also European Union, United Kingdom has also fundamental issues, fundamental problems. It cannot manufacture advanced semiconductors. The advanced manufacturing of semiconductors, is slowly moving to the United States, but not right now. TSMC is in Taiwan. It's at risk as well. The only one that I could think of in Europe, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is ASML. That's in Netherlands, which makes the machines that make chips. And it's equivalent. It still requires global supply chains, and it's not under European control. So yes, UK and announced a major strategy for sovereign venture investment this week. This was a major story, and kudos to them. But you could build data centers in Europe and UK, but you're still chip dependent. You're still energy dependent on non-European sources. And
absolutely, it's worth pointing out, Mark, that that 500 million pounds that the British government have pledged, there's a big question mark about where the investment's coming from. And Nvidia and other companies have pledged that they would build data centers and import chips into the UK, particularly to a new facility in Essex. It's not been built. It's just not happening. So actually, the physical infrastructure is just not there to underpin the ambitions. So I think things are moving forward, but actually there are significant problems that we face in the UK and other European countries. And then we have the regulatory situation as well, as you're very familiar with, which is out of step with regards to where the United States is on regulating this industry as it goes forward.
Absolutely. I want to go back to Will. We want to touch upon this major player. It is the largest player that has a lot at stake for this. That's NVIDIA. That's an indispensable company at this point, and every sovereign AI program runs on it. What's your take on it in terms of its geopolitical leverage, especially now it has its roots in the United States? We spoke about Palantir, CoreWeave, some of those companies. You've been monitoring them. We've been discussing that for years. What makes it indispensable, and how will this impact the whole discussion?
That is one that's, good for them. An insane point of leverage for them, that everybody shops there, basically, right? That's a vast majority of anyone who's running on those chips is. And so it gives them extraordinary leverage, but it's also, if something happens to them or their company or their ability to get their supply out of where they are, then that's going to start that cascade of, yes, we have chips on hand, but when do we start running out? When do we need more that we can't get? And that's fascinating to me, Mark. You're far more, deep into this than I am. But if all of a sudden NVIDIA says, we're not going to do business with you anymore, or we don't like the way this country's going, or we find you too unstable, then that almost basically closes the gate. They put a moat around that country. Nothing can come in or out.
They control the sovereignty. So basically, Will, you're absolutely right. They have what I call extraordinary geopolitical leverage. It's extraordinary. It creates significant vulnerability for anyone to get their chips. And this week, I'm going to be in Silicon Valley, actually next week, their major conference. They'll be announcing, I'm sure, new products getting into physical AI, humanoid robots. Palantir, another major player, is doing something fascinating. They have built an entire business around the proposition that governments should not have to choose between the AI capabilities and data sovereignty. Their platform runs on classified environments. This is the highest value end in the market today. And you have a company, which everybody should pay attention that are listening to us, CoreWeave. They make sovereign AI compute accessible. Without them, sovereign compute cannot be accessible to organizations. They cannot build their own data centers. CoreWeave is responsible. So those are the fastest growing infrastructure players. They're all coming from the United States. We haven't seen anything like this in recent memory. And they're just ballooning, they're booming to the next level. And I want to now move to the discussion to get a little bit more, even more practical. Let's assume it's a mid-size government or a large company who wants to build a sovereign infrastructure. What is actually in their way? There's lots of obstacles, lots of challenges. So I want to try to list some of those obstacles. Start with you, Dominic. What are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of obstacles?
Well, I think, you've got to have a good scientific research base. I think the UK does to a degree. You've got to be able to attract talent. So your economy and the way your tax system works needs to be able to attract the investment and actually getting the talented people to come and live in that country and work in that country. You also need, as we've seen, with the situation in Dubai and the wider region, you need security. You need to be able to maintain security so that people feel secure in terms of their investment, but also their personal and their family lives as well. Otherwise, everything gets disrupted. And, you need to ensure that you can maintain energy security. I think, the situation with NVIDIA is interesting. It strikes me it has a very powerful monopoly, if that's the word to use, on chip manufacturing. As to whether it's very good for the company, it's a very powerful position for them. As to whether it's good for the global economy and for governments going forward, I think that's probably a broader question. I think there needs to be a means of ensuring a more equitable distribution of technology for chip development and manufacturing. And that's going to be a big challenge, I think, for many countries when they want to develop that sovereign development base for their AI industry. So I think there needs to be a real belief in investing in your economy. It's not just a simple case of flying the flag saying we want to be an AI superpower. But I think there also has to be a certain level of global cooperation on all of this as well. The one thing I'm taking away from this is you can't do this as a nation state and disconnect yourself from the global world that we're all living in, and the need for more cooperation. So things like, we go back to the Strait of Hormuz and energy centers and transmission routes. They need to be protected. And, I think we're probably going to see a significant shift in AI technology into the defense industries. That'll be a booming industry because of what we're seeing playing out in the Middle East at the moment. But there are huge opportunities. But the threats of biosecurity, the threats of cybersecurity attacks, of malign actors, be it from North Korea or Russia or others that are getting increasingly sophisticated in attacking what are very complex, computer systems that run our states, is another big problem that I think we in Britain are having to experience, and other countries as well.
Will, what do you think is very alarming point of failure right now, obstacle that you're seeing that we need to fix?
Well, I mean, the big one cost, what did you say, 1 to 5 billion to build this out? And then the other one that Dominic touched on, talent scarcity. One, I think you've told me, Mark, there's like about 50,000 engineers globally who can do this, and they're in a handful of cities. One, how do those people get access to work with more companies? And then in the long term, how can we train and create more of these people that know how to do this, that are, as we talked to, good actors, people that will work in the best interest of the nation that they work in and work for? Those are the two that I just think, from way back in my history of being an educator, that how can we create more of these people and give, because talent is distributed equally across the globe, that everyone kind of has the same hardware, but how do we get more software into these folks globally?
Yeah, and I think
go ahead, Dominic.
That employment issue I wanted to talk about, Mark, because we've seen huge spikes in unemployment in the United States. Youth unemployment is climbing very quickly in the United Kingdom and across Europe. Mm-hmm. AI application is now driven to a large degree, you know this, Mark, through the companies you advise, towards consolidating, the whole supply chain and making everything more efficient and reducing headcount. But are we throwing away the future of a generation? Are we potentially throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if that's the word to use, in our drive to save money and make things more efficient? How do we offer young people the opportunity to develop their talents? Because they're going to be the future of this industry, and that really worries me at the moment.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think we both have written extensively on Gen Z. Gen Z right now is being suffocated. It's suffocating internally and externally, and no one is focusing. No one has real solutions and ways to solve their problems. They graduate from fancy universities and they can't find meaningful work. Meaningful work doesn't mean working at McDonald's. And unfortunately it ties in for their employment, working for some of those critical infrastructure companies and startups. So that's a big problem. But for the audience, I think we all agree cost is the first and most obvious. A hyperscaler data center, the kind you need serious AI training, cost is 1 to 5 billion, massive amount to build. Single chip cluster capable of training frontier models, LLM models, Anthropic, ChatGPT, you name it, runs hundreds of millions. Energy infrastructure is adding billions. So corporate, this is not corporate capex. This is massive. This is only for sovereign wealth funds or for the governments. And so we have chip dependency, Dominic, you pointed out. We have energy scarcity, Will, that you pointed out. We have massive energy, and we are trying to resolve this with modular nuclear. We're looking at companies like Oklo, like Kairos Power are building it, but it requires a lot more than just few companies in Silicon Valley. It requires regulatory courage, and we don't have that. In the meantime, you're dependent on the grid, and the grid doesn't work, so we go back to fossil fuel and reliancy. Everybody's coming back. Should we fund this by gas? And then talent. We all spoke about talent, and we are big proponents that the younger people should get a bigger role, and they're not. The engineers are architecting, operating all of this infrastructure. Very difficult to hire those types of experts. They're probably the rarest species on this planet Earth. And this is what I would say. There are probably 50,000 of them globally from AI and infrastructure, 50,000 of them globally. This is the number. People, they're clustered in 5 cities, in Silicon Valley, San Francisco being one of them, and then across few places around the world. And regulatory fragmentation. Nobody knows what the laws are. Governance framework is all broken. United Nations is not functioning today. cross-border data transfer restrictions. Organizations are trying to follow multiple jurisdictions if they're based in city or state or federal government or international. This is completely nuts. But I also think that there's something new that we could say on this program that is not official narrative. Sovereign wealth, heads of state, national security advisors, people who speak candidly in private, they're basically saying there are a couple of drivers that I want to point out that are much more visceral or much more important in the competitive language. And one of them is what kind of conversations we're hearing. And this conversation that we're hearing is very critical because digital colonialism is what's happening now. It's the fear, and the fear is very explicit. The nations cannot build their own AI infrastructure. They are dependent on China or United States. I obviously feel proud that they depend on the United States, but is it right for them? Dependency is leveraged politically and economically, and this is important. Military AI, we have watched it in Ukraine with drones, we mentioned it, AI-assisted tagging, autonomous logistics, all of that is military stuff. The nation that can train faster, that has better capabilities in military, is going to deploy faster. Sovereign data infrastructure is not just separated from defense. It's all the same. We're finding out that investments in defense and military, it's all very much defense. And dollar weaponization, we spoke briefly about this, weaponization of how you weaponize the currency and the dollar and what happens. So now you have the conversations with finance ministers, with national security advisors. How could cloud suddenly be open and be open or be accessible or be closed? And then we have the governance issue, the AI governance issue. Everybody is meeting. Nations are building their own capabilities, but where is this capability or how is this accepted? Who is accepting that? What are the rules? What is the window that people could buy, could close, could sell? The governments are kind of trying to give you a roadmap, but nothing is really sustained. And so we have to think about those drivers. And it's not just competitiveness. You could see it, political survival, economic survival, military survival on this list. I want to get your comments, Dominic and Will, and then maybe get to them some solutions, and then we wrap up.
The one that pops out to me first is digital colonialism. Like I've lived in the United States my entire life, proud to live here. And I think of something like the Chinese government, where if you're that reliant on them and you have something they want, they can turn off what you need until you give them what they want. And I think that's the fear. To put it in those plain terms, it's you want this technology that you need, you're reliant on us for it, but we need this thing from you. And I can see that happening plain as day from the Chinese government. And that's the one, and then I'll hand it off to you, Dominic, the one that worries me the most, that someone who currently is our ally or not against us, that could be turned against, the United States or another friendly country just like that.
I agree. And I think the whole situation with China's influence in the world and how that plays out with regards to broader conflicts that we're seeing playing out in the Middle East, for example, at the moment, is opening up a whole can of worms. How do governments, even governments, in Europe or Canada or others, develop relationships with China, and how dependent can they suddenly become in relation to trade and technology, and the dangers of that too. I also think that, in some ways, it would be better to see the AI revolution decentralized so that you've got creativity. I'd like to see those clusters you talked about, Mark, in, say, 10 cities in the world, in 30, 40 cities in the world and beyond. I'd like to see them in developing countries. Let's remember that the global population increase of this planet significantly will be mostly in sub-Saharan Africa in the next 50 years. And that's where most of the world's problems will come in terms of ensuring an improving standard of living and all the issues around the environment. So we have to focus on the developing world. How can technology help people in the poorest regions to improve their lives? And healthcare and education. It shouldn't all just be a drive to military hardware. There's a danger now that will be a key driver because of the security threats we see. So I want to be more optimistic about how technology can be developed and regulated. I'm fearful if it becomes a superpower, standoff, which is where we're potentially heading at the moment. There's no easy solutions to that, but I think we need to keep our eye on that as well.
Dominic, so I agree with all of this. I think we spent a fair amount of time today for our audience focusing on sovereignty, on sovereign funds, on G7 governments, on governments that have much more control and more resources. But we want to also address startups and companies and people that could use some of those solutions. And
Yes.
I want to kick this off, and I'm going to ask my colleagues also to comment. I think when you walk into companies, something that all of us would clearly want advice on. First, energy audits. And you mentioned this, Will, in the beginning of the conversation. What should they be doing? Energy audits is the first thing they do before you build anything. Stop building. Think first. You map your dependency, reserve your position. You figure out your renewable capacity. What is it? What is it not? Design your compute infrastructure on realistic energy envelopes. And Dominic, you told us today you cannot separate compute strategy from energy strategy. That's all combined. And you mentioned, especially in countries that are well off or even vulnerable. The second thing that I would suggest is you cannot do it alone. We said, what is the private role here if the government does everything? No government could solve any problem. I think Ronald Reagan said, don't leave it to the government. The government is not going to solve all it doesn't have the answers. So it requires public-private partnerships. And you have to figure out how if you're actually going to build out, work on those data center solutions and those infrastructure solutions, or build new startups based on the models that we're describing, that the model has to be with working with public and private. It's private sector who operates technical capacity, business capacity, and efficiency. And this is how the rest of the world needs to be structured. Multilateral banks, we're not using enough of them. I think we forgot about them. World Bank, IFC, the Asian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, those institutions, what are they doing? I'm not sure I understand. I'm sure they're investing in emerging markets, but now it's a different game going on now. It's a different sovereign digital infrastructure. And can we bring them more up to this age so they offer something low-cost capital? They don't require not this expensive equity. What are those defense and intelligence community groups doing, especially when they're building new products? How could we bring them in? I know that they have high margins and stable revenue, but how could we bring them in the equation? And that I think we need to bring in phased sovereignty. You cannot build everything at once. It's not just building, or you say, I'm going to build everything at once. It's data sovereignty, compute sovereignty, and then fine-tuning. This is a 5 to 10 year journey, and there's a lot of moving pieces here to build this model. And finally, I want to say that we look at the examples of Llama, we look at the example of Mistral, we look at Falcon, what they're basically saying, and the Chinese have been using it, but for their advantage, they're using open models. And they're basically saying, we will put everything on open source, take it or leave it. It's up to you, but it's available for humanity. So I think we got to move more to open source so we can allow more players, more companies to use us instead of relying on expensive API-dependent OpenAI Anthropic. They're expensive and API-dependent. And we're seeing example of this with Mistral. We're seeing it with Llama. I know it's maybe not great for companies, but China is using it for their competitive advantage. And we got to figure out how to move to open source models. Only then we will have genuine AI sovereignty and accessible to all organizations, large or small. What is your take?
If you're a business leader out there and you want my opinion when you start, is that when you're dealing in technology, especially artificial intelligence, it is sexy and it is fun and it is exciting. But you cannot accomplish anything unless you take care of this boring baseline fundamental stuff. Like you said, energy audit it. You want to build an AI or technology company? How are you going to power it? It's simple as that. If you're going to build your house today, if I'm going to build a new house in St. Louis, Missouri, the first thing I got to do is figure out how I'm going to get power to it, how I'm going to get water to it. You have to take time and be incredibly deliberate up front and take care of all of that boring, mundane stuff to make sure that your amazing ideas, your sexy solutions to whatever problem you're trying to solve can come to fruition.
Yeah. And I think just a final point from me is that if we learn anything from the last few weeks, you can't disconnect yourself from the geopolitical developments in the world. You can't just look at this from a technology point of view. You've got to look at this from a global political, military, technology, environment, all of which is happening in the world and how that will impact upon your business plans and developments. And I think in boardrooms up and down the country at the moment, I'm sure they're thinking, my God, are we thinking enough about geopolitical risk? And are we building that in to our structures and our decision-making processes. And I think that's going to absolutely be critical for business going forward, which is why this discussion we've had today has been so valuable as well.
Valuable comments of final closing comments today. I'll kick this off, and then Will and Dominic. Obviously, we'll have many sessions and different topics over the weeks to come, because this geopolitical discussion is so vital. It's so vital for companies, for nations, for international organizations, for startups, for investors. Everybody needs to really understand this today. You cannot function. You cannot build a business. You cannot survive. You cannot be competitive. None of those things will really work out for you if you don't really understand the geopolitical environment. And the nations and companies that treat sovereignty as a press release, very bad. They will discover this vulnerability at the worst possible moment. We're seeing it in Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East right now. This is not a press release. This is not a marketing. This is not a ploy. This is a real crisis. This is a real geopolitical crisis. It makes dependencies almost impossible to ignore. We're living in a moment right now, when we're talking to you now in the beginning of March. This is the moment that things are happening across the world, and you got to be prepared. This is not a forecast. We're not here predicting. We're not futurists here. This is a current event. This is a window when you could build something or you could beg for closing. The strategic question for every board and every government and every founder and every investor is not whether you pursue sovereign digital infrastructure, you pursue AI development. You will pursue it. Everybody will. It's whether you're willing to do the hard work on the genuine sovereignty, actually what it actually requires. And it actually requires a lot of geopolitical thinking. And it's exactly what we're doing with this sovereign brief. This is conversation for you. This is a conversation that Mark, Dominic, and Will are bringing to our listeners, wherever you are around the world, so you could make the right decisions. If you're a board, if you're an executive committee, if your organization is going to need private briefings on sovereign digital infrastructure, on AI, and your specific exposure, you know where to come. You know where the neutral voice. We look at every single aspect across the world, and we're here to make sure every single time to give you updated information to make sure that you survive and thrive in those difficult moments. Will, I go to you, and then Dominic.
It's, Mark, exactly what you said. This isn't chaos theory anymore, where something happens here and it might affect you here. If you didn't know this 3 weeks ago, I hope you know it now, that if a shot's fired in the Middle East and you own a company in California or in Texas or in Missouri, that is going to affect you to the level which it affects you. It's going to be different for everybody. But like you said, Mark, we're a neutral voice. If you come here, you listen to this podcast, you reach out to any of us, we will not tell you about the world the way we wish it was. We will tell you about the world in the state it actually is in.
Yeah, and the final few words really from me is just to say, Mark, you're absolutely right. Your vision and energy, I think, has fed this process, because you have the ability to look at that longer term picture and see what's happening and then bring that to the fore so we can start taking decisions. And as Will has said, I think that's a crucial element of where we are. This is not just going to be a crisis that's going to go away if the conflict in the Middle East comes to an end in the next few weeks. We are going into a period of global continual crisis and change. And everything is geopolitically connected. And you need to be able to maintain infrastructure, secure infrastructure, energy for infrastructure. And you need to be able to do that in a nation state or a geopolitical region where you can have the security and the long-term guarantees allow you to make that investment. And also you need that talent, and you need to ensure that this industry that offers so much potential to the rest of the world can develop in a way that's going to benefit all of society in this very difficult political environment that we're living through. My view is, despite all the despondency, despite all the concern, there's a great deal that we can be optimistic about. And what I hope we can do with these podcasts is bring you our ideas and thoughts on where the world is heading, so that you can make the right decisions for the future, so that we can make this world a better place despite all the problems that we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Dominic. It was a very interesting session. I look forward to for the next episode on discussing major strategies on geopolitical situation around the world. All the best.